The morning rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morrison and Associates' sleek downtown office as 22-year-old Emma Chen sat at the reception desk, nervously straightening the same stack of papers for the third time in 5 minutes. As the newest intern at one of the city's most prestigious marketing firms, she had been relegated to covering reception duties during lunch breaks, a task that filled her with anxiety despite being far less demanding than the creative projects she desperately hoped to work on. Her supervisor had made it clear that interns were meant to be seen and not heard, invisible cogs in the corporate machine who should handle basic tasks without drawing attention to themselves. Emma's shyness had always been both her greatest weakness and her most carefully guarded secret strength. While her quieter nature made networking and office politics nearly impossible to navigate, it had also made her an exceptional observer of people, someone who noticed details that others missed and picked up on unspoken needs that more extroverted colleagues overlooked entirely. Today, however, her observational skills would be put to a test she never could have anticipated. The elevator doors opened with their usual soft chime, and Emma looked up from her paperwork to see a woman in her 50s stepping into the lobby. She was impeccably dressed in a charcoal business suit, carrying herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to important meetings, but there was something in her expression, a slight uncertainty, a careful way of scanning the reception area that caught Emma's attention immediately. "Good afternoon," Emma said with her practiced professional smile, then noticed that the woman's eyes were focused on her lips rather than making direct eye contact. "How may I help you?" The visitor pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, then showed Emma the screen. "I have a 2:30 appointment with David Morrison. I'm Helen Rodriguez from the Riverside Foundation." Emma's mind clicked into place immediately. She had learned American Sign Language in college, originally as an elective to fulfill her language requirement, but had continued studying it after volunteering at a community center where she worked with deaf children. It had been months since she'd had an opportunity to use ASL in a professional setting, and she felt a familiar flutter of nervousness about whether her skills were adequate for a business conversation. But as she watched Helen Rodriguez's patient expression and the careful way she held her phone, Emma made a decision that would change both of their lives. "Ms. Rodriguez," Emma said aloud while simultaneously beginning to sign, her hands moving in the fluid, graceful patterns of ASL. "Welcome to Morrison and Associates. I'm Emma, and I'll be happy to help you today." The transformation in Helen's face was immediate and profound. Her polite but guarded professional expression melted into something much warmer, surprise, relief, and genuine gratitude all crossing her features in rapid succession. "You sign?" Helen responded in ASL, her hands moving with the confident fluency of a native user. "I wasn't expecting. Most companies don't." "I'm sorry you've had that experience," Emma signed back, her confidence growing as she fell into the familiar rhythm of visual conversation. "Would you prefer to communicate in ASL, or would you like me to provide interpretation services during your meeting?" What Emma didn't know was that David Morrison, the CEO and founder of Morrison and Associates, had been walking toward the elevator when he spotted the interaction taking place at the reception desk. Something about the fluid hand movements and the obvious comfort of both women as they communicated had caught his attention, and he found himself pausing behind a decorative column to observe. Morrison was a man who had built his business on understanding communication, how messages were crafted, delivered and received by different audiences. But as he watched his shy intern seamlessly switch between spoken English and ASL, facilitating a conversation with the kind of natural empathy that couldn't be taught in business school, he realized he was witnessing something that went far beyond routine customer service. "The meeting is with Mr. Morrison himself." Emma continued signing while speaking aloud for any hearing colleagues who might be listening. "Would you like me to contact his office and let him know you've arrived? I can also provide interpretation during the meeting if that would be helpful." Helen's hands moved expressively as she responded. "That would be wonderful, but are you qualified for professional interpretation? I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position." Emma smiled, her usual shyness fading as she engaged in a form of communication where she felt truly confident. I'm certified through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. I volunteer at the Downtown Community Center, and I've done interpretation work for medical appointments and legal proceedings. Business meetings are well within my skill set. Morrison found himself leaning forward, intrigued not just by Emma's unexpected qualifications, but by the way she had immediately identified a client's needs and stepped up to meet them without seeking permission or following bureaucratic protocols. In his experience, most employees, especially interns, would have politely directed the visitor to wait while they found someone else to handle the special situation. I have to ask, Helen signed with obvious curiosity, what made you learn ASL? Most hearing people don't. Emma's expression grew thoughtful as she considered her response. My younger brother is deaf. He was born with profound hearing loss, and our family learned ASL when he was very young. But beyond that, I've always been drawn to languages and communication. There's something beautiful about ASL. It's not just translation, it's a complete cultural and linguistic experience. Morrison felt something click into place in his mind. He had been scheduled to meet with Helen Rodriguez about a potentially lucrative contract. The Riverside Foundation was looking for a marketing firm to handle their annual fundraising campaign, a project worth several $1,000,000. What he hadn't known was that Helen was deaf, and what he definitely hadn't anticipated was discovering that his most overlooked intern was perfectly equipped to facilitate what could be one of the most important meetings of the quarter. He made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of returning to his office to prepare for the meeting in the traditional way, Morrison approached the reception desk directly. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, extending his hand while nodding toward Emma to indicate she should interpret. I'm David Morrison. I apologize for interrupting, but I couldn't help but notice that Emma was providing interpretation services. Would you be comfortable if she joined our meeting as an interpreter? Emma's eyes widened in shock as she processed his request, her hands automatically moving to interpret his words even as her brain struggled to catch up with this unexpected development. She had been preparing to suggest that they contact a professional interpretation service, not imagining that she might be directly invited into a high-level business meeting. I would be very comfortable with that. Helen signed in response, her expression indicating both appreciation and approval of Morrison's directness. Emma has been extremely professional and skilled. I would actually prefer working with her if she's available. Morrison looked at Emma directly. Emma, I know this wasn't part of your planned responsibilities today, but would you be willing to provide interpretation services for our meeting? This is obviously beyond normal intern duties, so it would be compensated accordingly. Emma felt her heart racing as she considered the implications. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for, a chance to contribute something meaningful, to use her skills in a professional setting, to prove that she was more than just a quiet intern who could file papers and answer phones. But it was also terrifying, representing everything she found most challenging about corporate environments, being the center of attention, being responsible for facilitating high-stakes communication, being visible in a way that her shyness made uncomfortable. I would be honored to help, she said aloud while signing her response to Helen, but I want to make sure you're both comfortable with my level of experience. I've done professional interpretation work, but not in corporate settings. The fact that you're being transparent about your experience level actually increases my confidence in your professionalism, Morrison replied. And frankly, the alternative would be trying to reschedule while we locate and hire an outside interpreter, which could delay our conversation by days or weeks. The meeting that followed was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. Seated between Morrison and Helen around the polished conference table, she found herself not just interpreting language, but facilitating a conversation between two highly accomplished professionals who were exploring a complex business relationship. As the discussion progressed, Emma began to understand that the Riverside Foundation's work focused on accessibility advocacy and services for disabled individuals. Helen was seeking a marketing partner who could help them reach broader audiences while authentically representing the deaf and disabled community in their messaging. One of our biggest challenges, Helen explained through Emma's interpretation, is finding partners who understand that accessibility isn't an afterthought or a compliance requirement. It's integral to who we are and how we serve our community. Morrison leaned forward. His interest clearly piqued. Can you elaborate on what that looks like in practice? As Emma interpreted the complex discussion that followed, she found herself in the unique position of understanding both the business implications and the cultural nuances of what Helen was describing. Her years of involvement in the deaf community gave her insights that went beyond literal translation, allowing her to convey not just Helen's words but the deeper meanings and cultural contexts that informed her perspective. For example, Helen continued, when we create promotional materials, we don't just add captions as an afterthought. We design with visual accessibility in mind from the beginning. We include deaf community members in our creative process. We recognize that ASL isn't just English translated into hand movements. It's a complete language with its own grammar, culture, and artistic expression. Morrison was taking notes rapidly, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his genuine engagement with concepts that were clearly new to him. Emma found herself adding brief cultural explanations when she sensed that direct translation might not fully convey Helen's meaning, and both participants seemed to appreciate her insights. Emma, Morrison said during a brief pause in the conversation, you mentioned that you volunteer in the deaf community. From your perspective, what are some of the most common mistakes that businesses make when trying to serve deaf customers? Emma felt a moment of panic as she realized she was being asked for her own professional opinion, not just her interpretation services. But Helen's encouraging expression and Morrison's genuine curiosity gave her the confidence to respond. I think the biggest mistake is assuming that accommodation is the same as inclusion, she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about something she was passionate about. Many businesses focus on meeting legal requirements, providing interpreters when requested, adding closed captions to videos, but they don't think about creating environments where deaf individuals feel genuinely welcomed and valued. She paused, then continued. For instance, in marketing materials, deaf people are often portrayed as inspirational figures, overcoming obstacles, rather than as regular customers with diverse interests and needs. It's a subtle difference, but it affects whether someone feels seen as a person versus seen as a symbol. Morrison and Helen exchanged glances, both clearly impressed by Emma's thoughtful analysis. That's exactly the kind of insight we need, Helen signed enthusiastically. Someone who understands that accessibility is about dignity, not just compliance. The meeting continued for another hour, with Emma facilitating discussions about campaign strategies, budget allocations, and timeline considerations. By the time they concluded, Morrison and Helen had reached a preliminary agreement on a partnership that would span multiple years and several major projects. As Helen prepared to leave, she turned to Emma with an expression of genuine gratitude. Thank you for making this conversation possible, she signed. But more than that, thank you for understanding that communication is about connection, not just information transfer. After Helen left, Morrison asked Emma to remain in the conference room. Emma, he said, I have to be honest with you. When I hired you as an intern, I saw your resume and your academic credentials. But I had no idea about your interpretation skills or your involvement with the deaf community. Emma felt her familiar nervousness returning, unsure whether this conversation was heading toward praise or criticism. I want to offer you a choice, Morrison continued. You can continue with your internship as originally planned, focusing on general marketing tasks and administrative support. Or if you're interested, I'd like to create a new position for you, accessibility consultant and community liaison. It would involve working directly with clients like Helen, helping us develop genuinely inclusive marketing strategies, and building relationships with disability advocacy organizations. Emma stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. Mr. Morrison, I'm not sure I have enough experience for that kind of role. Emma, experience can be taught. What you demonstrated today, cultural competency, professional judgment, the ability to facilitate complex conversations, those are much rarer qualities. And frankly, the business world needs more people who understand that good communication means meeting people where they are, not forcing them to adapt to our preferred methods. 6 months later, Emma Chen was no longer the shy intern who nervously straightened papers at the reception desk. As Morrison and Associates Director of Accessibility and Inclusive Communications, she had helped the firm land several major contracts with disability advocacy organizations, developed training programs for staff on inclusive client services, and created marketing campaigns that authentically represented diverse communities. The partnership with the Riverside Foundation had become one of the firm's most successful and fulfilling projects, with Helen Rodriguez serving as both a client and a mentor to Emma as she navigated her new role. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had discovered that her shyness hadn't been a weakness to overcome. It had been preparation for a career that required careful observation, genuine empathy, and the ability to create spaces where everyone's voice could be heard, regardless of how that voice was expressed. The day she had chosen to use sign language with a deaf visitor, thinking no one was watching, had actually been the day someone finally saw her for who she truly was. Not an invisible intern, but a bridge builder with the rare ability to connect people across the differences that too often divide them. Morrison often reflected on that rainy afternoon, realizing that the most valuable business insight he'd gained hadn't come from market research or competitive analysis, but from watching a quiet young woman demonstrate that true communication was about respect, understanding, and the willingness to meet people exactly where they were.